Sweat beaded on Damien Rhodes's forehead, not from the crisp autumn breeze sweeping through the affluent streets of Oakwell Terrace, but from the blinding glare of a police flashlight shoved inches from his retinas. He was sitting on the polished mahogany steps of a $10 million historic brownstone, his brownstone. Yet the snarling patrolman towering over him, hand hovering dangerously close to a standard-issue firearm, saw only a trespasser in a faded gray hoodie. What started as a peaceful morning coffee was rapidly spiraling into a devastating collision of arrogance, prejudice, and a spectacular, foundation-shattering dose of impending karma. Mornings in the historic Back Bay district of Boston were usually reserved for a specific kind of silence. It was a wealthy, insulated quiet, punctuated only by the distant hum of expensive foreign cars and the gentle rustling of old oak trees shedding their amber leaves. For Damien Rhodes, a 42-year-old software architect who had recently sold his financial tech startup for a staggering sum, this silence was a hard-won luxury. Damien had grown up in a rougher, far less forgiving part of the city. He remembered taking the train into these wealthy neighborhoods as a teenager, marveling at the towering brick facades, the immaculate wrought iron fences, and the heavy oak doors that seemed to guard secrets of generational wealth. Now he owned one of those very buildings. He had not just bought a condo. He had purchased the entire 6-unit historic brownstone at the corner of Commonwealth Avenue outright. He occupied the sprawling, custom-renovated penthouse and rented out the remaining 5 luxury units to a curated list of high-profile tenants. The world was still asleep. Damien stepped out onto his grand front stoop. He was dressed in his favorite threadbare Yale University sweatpants, a relic from his graduate school days, and a faded gray hooded sweatshirt. He wore scuffed moccasins on his feet. In his hands he cradled a steaming mug of black pour-over coffee. He sat down on the top step, resting his back against the cold stone pillar, simply breathing in the morning air. He closed his eyes, listening to the city slowly wake up, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. Directly across the street, however, gratitude was not the prevailing emotion. Vivian Hargrove, a 71-year-old widow who treated the neighborhood association rules like a sacred religious text, was already awake. Standing behind the sheer curtains of her second-floor drawing room, she held a pair of brass opera glasses to her eyes. Vivian had lived on the street for 40 years. She knew everyone, or at least she knew everyone she deemed worth knowing. She knew the investment bankers, the surgeons, the old money heirs. When her opera glasses focused on Damien, her jaw tightened. She saw a large black man in heavily worn, baggy clothing loitering on the pristine steps of the Rhodes building. She did not know Damien. She had been wintering in Palm Beach during the months the building had been sold and renovated. To her prejudiced, highly filtered worldview, the man sitting on those steps did not fit the aesthetic of her neighborhood. He looked like a vagrant, a threat, a stain on the immaculate canvas of her morning. Vivian did not hesitate. She did not walk across the street to offer a neighborly greeting. She turned away from the window, picked up her cordless landline phone, and dialed the local precinct directly, bypassing emergency services to speak to a desk sergeant she knew from her frequent noise complaints. "Yes, Sergeant Higgins? This is Vivian Hargrove on Commonwealth. I need a patrol car dispatched immediately. There is a suspicious individual casing the building across the street from me. Yes, the old Sterling property. He is sitting right on the front steps. He looks dangerous, and he absolutely does not belong here. Please send someone before he tries to break in." Back on his steps, Damien took a slow sip of his coffee, completely oblivious to the fact that his mere existence in a gray hoodie had just set off a chain reaction. He was busy calculating the acoustics of his upcoming living room renovation, completely at peace, unaware that the heavy machinery of systemic bias was currently rolling toward his front door. Officer Vance Harlan had been riding in a patrol cruiser for 15 years. At 38, he was a seasoned veteran of the force, but a bitter one. He was known among his colleagues for his aggressive approach, a man who saw the city not as a community to protect, but as a battleground to control. He was nearing the end of a grueling overnight shift, running on stale gas station coffee and a mounting headache when the dispatch came through the radio. "Unit 4, suspicious person reported at 412 Commonwealth. Caller states male subject is loitering on the steps, possible attempted burglary in progress. Approach with caution. Harlan clicked his radio. Unit 4, copy. I'm 2 blocks away. He swung his cruiser around the corner, the tires squealing slightly against the damp asphalt. He did not activate his sirens, standard protocol for a potential burglary to avoid spooking the suspect, but he kept his flashing lights on as he aggressively pulled up to the curb directly in front of Damien's building. Damien opened his eyes as the police cruiser halted violently in front of his home. He watched calmly as the driver's side door flew open. Officer Harlan stepped out, a large, imposing man with a tight buzz cut and a posture that radiated hostility. He slammed the car door shut, adjusted his utility belt, and rested his right hand casually, yet deliberately, on the butt of his sidearm. He strode up the cobblestone walkway toward the mahogany steps. "Morning, officer," Damien said, his voice deep, even, and polite. He did not stand up. He remained seated on his top step, resting his forearms on his knees. Harlan did not return the greeting. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at Damien with a sneer of open disgust. His eyes quickly scanned Damien's worn sweatpants and faded hoodie. "Get up," Harlan ordered, his voice echoing sharply down the quiet, tree-lined street. Damien frowned slightly, the peaceful aura of his morning instantly shattering. "Excuse me? You heard me. Get up on your feet. You're trespassing on private property. Time to move along, buddy. The shelters are open downtown, but you can't sleep here." Damien let out a small, almost incredulous breath. He looked down at his clothes, then back at the officer, instantly understanding the rapid, prejudiced calculus the policeman had just performed. "Officer, I'm not trespassing. I'm drinking my coffee." "I don't care what you're drinking," Harlan snapped, taking one step up the stairs, closing the distance. "I got a call about a suspicious person casing this building. Now, unless you want to spend your morning in a holding cell for trespassing and vagrancy, you're going to stand up, turn around, and start walking." Damien remained seated. The years he had spent navigating corporate boardrooms, dealing with hostile takeovers, and aggressive venture capitalists had taught him how to handle bullies. You never met their emotional spike. You remained a flat, immovable line. "I appreciate your concern for the neighborhood, officer," Damien said, his tone remaining perfectly conversational. "But the caller was mistaken. I'm not casing the building. I live here." Harlan let out a harsh, barking laugh. It was a sound devoid of any real humor. "You live here, right? In a $10 million Back Bay brownstone, in those rags." "These rags are my morning clothes," Damien replied. "And yes, I live here." "All right. Let's play your game," Harlan said, his face hardening, his patience evaporating. "You live here. Show me your key. Better yet, show me a state-issued ID with this exact address printed on it." Damien sighed. He had left his wallet upstairs on the kitchen island. He only had his phone in his pocket. "My wallet is upstairs in my apartment. I don't carry my ID when I step onto my own front porch to drink my morning coffee." "Convenient," Harlan sneered. He took another step up. He was now looming over Damien. The air between them crackled with tension. "Here's what's actually going to happen. You're going to stand up, put your hands behind your back, and we're going to take a little ride down to the station while I figure out who you actually are. Because right now, all I see is a trespasser refusing a lawful order. Although, it's not a lawful order if I'm on my own property," Damien stated firmly, finally standing up. At 6'2", Damien was just as tall as Harlan, and his sudden rise forced the officer to take a half step back to maintain his dominant space. "You need reasonable, articulable suspicion that I have committed a crime to demand my identification. Sitting quietly on a porch is not a crime." Harlan's face flushed a deep, angry red. He despised civilians who quoted the law. He despised it even more when they were right, though his ego refused to acknowledge it. "You're resisting, buddy. I'm giving you one last warning." "I'm not resisting," Damien said calmly. He reached into his sweatpants pocket. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Harlan barked, unsnapping the holster of his service weapon. Damien froze immediately. He slowly pulled his hand out, revealing only a sleek, black smartphone. "I am pulling out my phone, officer. I'm going to record this interaction for my own safety, as is my right." "Put the phone away," Harlan commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, guttural growl. "You do not have my permission to record me." "I don't need your permission in a public space," Damien replied, tapping the screen and lifting the phone to frame the angry officer's face. "I'm standing on the front steps of my home, and this officer is threatening me with a weapon for drinking coffee." The red recording dot on Damien's phone screen seemed to push Officer Harlan over the edge of rational police work. For a man accustomed to absolute compliance, the sight of a calm, defiant civilian holding a camera was an intolerable challenge to his authority. "I said put the damn phone down!" Harlan lunged forward, closing the final 2 steps between them in a split second. He reached out with his left hand, attempting to swat the phone from Damien's grip. Damien, anticipating the aggressive move, quickly pivoted his shoulder, taking a step back toward his heavy front doors. Harlan's hand swiped through empty air. "Do not touch me," Damien warned, his voice finally losing its conversational warmth, dropping into a register of absolute, ironclad authority. "If you assault me on my own property, I promise you it will be the last mistake of your career." "Assault?" Harlan spat, drawing his taser with lightning speed and pointing the bright yellow device squarely at Damien's chest. The red laser targeting dot danced nervously over the faded Yale logo on Damien's sweatshirt. "You are interfering with an investigation. Turn around and put your hands on the door. Now." Across the street, the commotion had finally drawn an audience. Vivian Hargrove had stepped out onto her balcony, clutching her robe tightly around her neck. A victorious, self-satisfied smirk playing on her lips. She felt vindicated. The police were handling the vagrant. Down the block, an older gentleman walking a golden retriever stopped in his tracks, pulling out his own phone to watch. A young couple jogging past slowed to a halt, their expressions morphing from morning grogginess to profound alarm. Damien looked down at the red laser dot on his chest. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a primal response to the immediate threat of violence. But his mind remained sharply analytical. He knew that any sudden movement, any raise of his voice, would be weaponized against him in the police report. He had seen this story play out too many times on the evening news to become another tragic statistic. "Officer," Damien said, speaking slowly and loudly enough for the gathering onlookers to hear, "you are pointing a weapon at an unarmed man who is standing on his own property. I live at 412 Commonwealth Avenue. I own this building. If you deploy that weapon, you will be violating my civil rights, and I will ensure you are held entirely accountable." "Stop lying!" Harlan shouted, his finger hovering over the taser's trigger. He reached for his shoulder radio. "Dispatch, Unit 4. I need backup at 412 Commonwealth. Uncooperative suspect resisting detention. Roll a second unit, step on it." "Copy, Unit 4. Backup is en route." Damien stood perfectly still. "I want your name and badge number." "You'll get it when you're in holding," Harlan retorted, his chest heaving. He was trapped in his own escalation. He could not back down now, not with the suspect recording him and civilians watching. His ego demanded total submission. Within moments, the wail of approaching sirens shattered the morning air entirely. Another police cruiser tore down the street, mounting the curb slightly before coming to a jerking halt behind Harlan's vehicle. 2 officers sprang from the car. The first was Officer Thomas, a younger, slightly panicked-looking cop. The second was Sergeant Lawson, a veteran supervisor with graying temples and a sharp, calculating gaze. "Harlan, what's the situation?" Sergeant Lawson asked loudly, quickly assessing the scene as he jogged up the walkway. He noted the drawn taser, the recording phone, and the calm but tense posture of the black man on the steps. "Suspect is trespassing, refusing to identify and resisting detention, Sarge," Harlan reported, not taking his eyes off Damien. "Caller reported him casing the joint." Sergeant Lawson frowned. He looked at Damien, really looking at him. He saw the worn clothes, yes, but he also saw the custom-made moccasins. He noticed the posture, not the erratic stance of a desperate burglar, but the grounded, composed stance of a man entirely sure of his right to exist in that space. "Sir," Sergeant Lawson said, adopting a professional, de-escalating tone. "I'm Sergeant Lawson. Can you please put the phone down so we can talk about this?" "I will keep recording for my safety, Sergeant," Damien replied without wavering. "Your officer approached me while I was drinking coffee on my own front porch. He demanded ID without cause, threatened to arrest me, lunged at me, and is now pointing a taser at my chest. I told him I live here. I told him my wallet is upstairs. He refused to listen." Lawson shot a quick, hard glance at Harlan. "Holster the taser, Vance." "Sarge, he's non-compliant." "I said holster it," Lawson ordered, his voice brooking no argument. Harlan gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw popping. Reluctantly, he lowered the weapon and shoved it back into its thigh holster, though he kept his hand resting near his firearm. "Thank you," Damien said. "Sir, you claim I live here," Lawson continued, stepping in front of Harlan to create a physical barrier between the aggressive officer and Damien. "Do you have any way to prove that right now? A key? Someone inside who can vouch for you?" Damien lowered his phone slightly, though he kept the camera rolling. He was about to offer to walk upstairs with the sergeant to retrieve his wallet when the heavy oak front doors behind him suddenly swung open. Stepping out onto the porch was a woman in her late 30s, dressed in a sharp, tailored business suit, holding a leather portfolio. This was Charlotte Kane, a prominent corporate attorney and one of Damien's high-paying tenants who leased the second-floor unit. She had an early morning flight and was rushing out to her waiting town car. Charlotte stopped dead in her tracks, taking in the scene, the flashing police lights, the gathered crowd, the 3 officers, and her landlord standing with his phone raised. "Damien?" Charlotte asked, her voice laced with profound confusion. She looked from Damien to the police officers. "What on earth is going on here?" Officer Harlan scoffed, taking a step forward. "Ma'am, please step back inside for your own safety. We are handling a trespasser." Charlotte's eyes widened in disbelief. She looked at Harlan as if he had just sprouted a second head. "A trespasser? Are you out of your mind?" "Ma'am," Sergeant Lawson warned, "do you know this man? Know him?" Charlotte let out a sharp, aristocratic laugh of purest astonishment. She walked right past the officers and stood shoulder to shoulder with Damien. She looked Sergeant Lawson dead in the eye. "Sergeant, this is Damien Rhodes. He doesn't just live in the penthouse. He is my landlord. He owns this entire building." Sergeant Lawson felt a cold drop of sweat trace a path down his spine. The morning air suddenly felt suffocating. He looked at Charlotte Kane, taking in her immaculate tailored suit, the crisp leather of her briefcase, and the absolute unyielding certainty in her eyes. He had been on the force long enough to recognize a high-powered attorney when he saw one. They possessed a specific type of armor woven from Ivy League degrees and billable hours that deflected police intimidation effortlessly. "Ma'am," Lawson started, his voice losing its authoritative edge and taking on a placating tone, "are you absolutely certain this man—" "I am absolutely certain," Charlotte cut him off, her voice ringing like a struck crystal glass in the quiet street. "I signed a 2-year lease with Mr. Rhodes's holding company weeks ago. I had dinner with him in the penthouse recently. You are currently trespassing on his private walkway and threatening him with a deadly weapon. I highly suggest you lower your hands and step back." Officer Vance Harlan's face flushed and mottled a dangerous crimson. His ego, fragile and bloated, simply could not process the paradigm shift. To him, the man in the faded hoodie was a target, a lesser being who dared to defy his command. The idea that this man was vastly wealthier and more powerful than him was a cognitive dissonance he refused to accept. "She's lying to cover for him," Harlan shouted, stepping around Sergeant Lawson, his hand hovering over his service weapon once more. "She's probably in on whatever he's doing. Let me see your ID too, lady, now." Charlotte did not flinch. She slowly reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out a sleek silver business card case, extracted a thick embossed card, and held it out with 2 fingers. "My name is Charlotte Kane. I am a senior partner at Kane, Klein & Associates," she said, her voice dropping into a deadly professional whisper. "If you so much as reach for those handcuffs, Officer Harlan, I will personally guarantee that by tomorrow morning you will be the subject of a federal civil rights lawsuit so devastating it will bankrupt your union, strip your pension, and leave you working mall security for the rest of your miserable life. Do you understand me?" Harlan froze. The name of the law firm hit him like a physical blow. Kane, Klein & Associates was not just a law firm. They were the apex predators of Boston's legal ecosystem. They represented tech billionaires, pharmaceutical giants, and, crucially, had recently humiliated the city in a massive police misconduct settlement. Sergeant Lawson lunged forward, grabbing Harlan by the tactical vest and physically shoving him backward toward the cruiser. "Back off, Vance. Get in the car. Now." "Sarge, he's a suspect." "I said get in the damn car," Lawson roared, his command finally shattering Harlan's obstinate rage. Harlan glared at Damien, then at Charlotte, before spinning on his heel and storming back to his cruiser, slamming his fists against the steering wheel once he was inside. Lawson took a deep, shuddering breath, turning back to Damien and Charlotte. He removed his uniform cap, running a hand through his graying hair. The situation was a nightmare. A fully recorded, legally witnessed, high-profile nightmare. "Mr. Rhodes," Lawson said, his tone entirely deferential now. "I apologize for the misunderstanding. We received a direct call to the precinct from a neighbor reporting a suspicious individual casing the property." Damien lowered his phone, though he tapped the screen to ensure the video had saved to his cloud storage. He felt the adrenaline slowly leaching out of his system, replaced by a cold, calculating anger. He looked past the sergeant, his eyes scanning the houses across the street. He spotted a figure hurriedly stepping back from a second-floor balcony behind sheer curtains. Vivian Hargrove. "A misunderstanding, Sergeant," Damien repeated quietly. "Your officer didn't approach me to ask questions. He approached me to give orders. He assumed my guilt based on his own prejudices and the prejudiced phone call of a neighbor. He escalated to the threat of lethal force within moments because I refused to surrender my constitutional rights on my own front porch. He acted outside of protocol, sir. I will be filing a report." "No, Sergeant, I will be filing the report," Damien corrected him smoothly. "I have his badge number from the video. I have your name. I have the entire interaction recorded in high resolution. I suggest you and your officers leave my property immediately." Lawson nodded sharply, knowing any further attempt to apologize would only dig the hole deeper. "Have a good day, Mr. Rhodes. Miss Kane?" He turned and jogged back to his cruiser, the flashing lights casting long, erratic shadows across the historic brick facades as the police vehicles hastily retreated from Oakwell Terrace. Charlotte let out a long breath, her professional veneer cracking slightly to reveal genuine shock. "Damien, are you all right?" Damien looked down at his coffee mug. It was entirely cold. "I'm fine, Charlotte. Thank you for stepping out when you did. I'm sorry to delay your trip to the airport." "Don't be ridiculous," she said, adjusting her briefcase. "I'm calling my partners from the car. If you want to pursue this, Damien, you have the entire weight of my firm behind you pro bono." "I appreciate that," Damien said, a tight, humorless smile touching his lips. "But I think I'm going to handle this one a little differently. Have a safe flight to London." As Charlotte's town car pulled away, Damien turned back to his building. He did not go inside immediately. Instead, he stood on his top step, looking directly across the street at Vivian Hargrove's window. He knew she was watching. He raised his cold coffee mug in a slow, deliberate mock toast. The war had not ended with the police leaving. It had merely shifted battlegrounds. The video was no longer just a file on Damien Rhodes's phone. He had not posted it to social media blindly, screaming into the digital void. Damien was a man who understood leverage, networks, and the precise application of pressure. He had spent his career building systems that disrupted outdated industries. He was about to apply that same methodology to Officer Vance Harlan and Vivian Hargrove. He sent the raw footage directly to Marcus Sterling, an investigative journalist for the city's largest independent news outlet, who happened to be a former college roommate. Marcus had spent years trying to expose a pattern of racial profiling within the local precinct, specifically targeting a few notorious officers. Officer Harlan was at the top of that list. The article dropped. The headline was clinical and devastating. "Tech millionaire held at Taser point on own porch. Video exposes precinct's profiling crisis." The accompanying video, perfectly clear, showcased Harlan's aggressive swagger, his immediate jump to threats, and his refusal to listen to reason. It also highlighted Damien's chillingly calm recitation of his rights. The video had millions of views locally. National news syndicates picked it up. Inside the precinct, chaos reigned. The precinct captain, a political animal named Grant, was fielding screaming phone calls from the mayor's office. Officer Harlan had been immediately stripped of his badge and gun and placed on unpaid administrative leave pending a full internal affairs investigation. But Damien was not just going after the weapon, he was going after the hand that aimed it. Damien sat in his penthouse office, the mahogany walls lined with servers and monitors. He was on a video conference call with his personal attorney, Richard Kane, a man who possessed the warmth of a great white shark and the legal acumen of a Supreme Court justice. "The police department is offering a settlement, Damien," Richard said, adjusting his glasses. "Fast track, 7 figures. Jonas, they want this to go away quietly. Botanet gas. Decline it, Damien said, leaning back in his leather chair. I don't need their money. I want Harlan off the force, stripped of his pension and barred from private security work. I want the systemic issue addressed. Done? Richard noted on his legal pad. And what about the caller? The police log released to the press redacts the caller's information. Her name is Vivian Hargrove, Damien said, pulling up a file on his secondary monitor. 71 years old, lives across the street. She did not call emergency services. She called the precinct directly. She used a backdoor channel to weaponize the police against someone she did not like the look of. Do you want to sue her for intentional infliction of emotional distress? Defamation? Richard asked. Damien smiled. It was not a kind smile. No, lawsuits take years. They give people time to play the victim. I prefer structural reorganization. Damien turned his attention to the data he had spent the morning compiling. Vivian Hargrove was not just a resident. She was the reigning president of the Oakwell Terrace Historic Preservation Society, a fiercely exclusive neighborhood association that controlled everything from paint colors to parking permits. She wielded her position like a medieval monarch, making life miserable for anyone who crossed her. Richard, pull up the property records for Oakwell Terrace, Damien instructed. Specifically, the commercial parcels at the end of the block and the 3 multifamily units currently listed by the estate of Charles Whitmore. Richard typed for a moment. I see them. The Whitmore estate is desperate to liquidate to cover tax liabilities. Buy them, Damien said calmly. All of them. Cash offer, 20% above asking, waiving all contingencies provided we close soon. Richard blinked. Damien, that's nearly $18 million in real estate. I am aware, Damien replied. Once we hold title to those properties, plus my building, we will possess 62% of the voting rights within the Oakwell Terrace Historic Preservation Society. Richard stopped typing. A slow, deeply appreciative grin spread across the lawyer's face. He suddenly understood the architecture of the karma Damien was building. You're going to hostile take over her neighborhood watch. I'm going to dissolve her fiefdom, Damien corrected. Vivian Hargrove believes she dictates who belongs in this neighborhood. She used the police as her personal bouncers. I'm going to legally, quietly, and completely remove her power to ever do that to anyone else again. Meanwhile, across the street, Vivian Hargrove was pacing her Aubusson rug in a state of mounting panic. Her landline had been ringing incessantly. The neighborhood gossip chain, usually her domain, had turned against her. The news had broken that the vagrant she called the cops on was the tech billionaire who had just bought the Sterling building. She poured herself a sherry with trembling hands. How was I supposed to know? She justified to her empty drawing room. He looked like a thug. Her phone rang again. This time, caller ID showed the name of a fellow board member, an older gentleman named Arthur, who usually agreed with her every word. She snatched it up. Arthur, thank goodness. Have you seen the ridiculous news? She gasped. Vivian. Arthur's voice was cold, distant. I'm calling to inform you that an emergency meeting of the Preservation Society has been called. The only item on the agenda is a vote of no confidence regarding your presidency, followed by a motion to dissolve the current board entirely. The crystal sherry glass slipped from Vivian's manicured fingers, shattering into dozens of glittering, jagged pieces on the antique floorboards. The emergency meeting was held in the grand ballroom of the nearby Copley Plaza Hotel, a venue Vivian Hargrove usually reserved for the annual winter gala. Tonight, however, the crystal chandeliers illuminated a room thick with anxiety, whispers, and the palpable scent of an impending coup. Vivian stood behind the mahogany podium at the front of the room, adjusting her pearl necklace with trembling, clammy fingers. She had spent the last days calling in every favor, reminding every board member of the exclusive dinner parties she had hosted and the zoning variances she had secured for them. But the faces staring back at her were not those of loyal subjects. They were the faces of rats, calculating the exact distance to the nearest sinking ship's exit. The heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a synchronized, echoing thud. The murmurs in the room died instantly. Damien Rhodes did not enter wearing a faded gray Yale hoodie. He walked in wearing a bespoke midnight blue Tom Ford suit that draped flawlessly over his broad shoulders, a crisp white shirt, and no tie. He moved with the predatory, unhurried grace of a man who owned not just the room, but the ground it was built upon. Flanking him was Richard Kane, carrying a thick leather briefcase that looked heavy enough to contain an anvil. Vivian's throat went bone dry. She gripped the edges of the podium so tightly her knuckles turned a mottled white. "Mr. Rhodes," Vivian projected, her voice shrill and trembling as Damien walked slowly down the center aisle. "This is a closed meeting for property owners of the Oakwell Terrace Association. You are a new resident. You do not have the floor." Damien stopped in the front row. He did not sit down. He simply looked up at her, his expression utterly devoid of sympathy. "I am not here to ask for the floor, Mrs. Hargrove. I am here to take it." Richard Kane stepped forward, opening his briefcase and withdrawing a stack of heavily notarized blue-backed legal documents. He handed copies to the pale-faced association secretary sitting adjacent to the podium. "For the official record," Richard announced, his voice booming effortlessly across the silent ballroom. "As of this afternoon, my client, Damien Rhodes, via his primary holding corporation, has finalized the purchase of the Whitmore Estate properties, the commercial parcels at the end of the block, and the sterling brownstone. According to the association's own bylaws, specifically Section 4, Paragraph B, which Mrs. Hargrove herself authored to consolidate her own power, voting rights are distributed by square footage of owned property within the district." The secretary adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents frantically. He looked up at Vivian, his face a mask of profound apology. "Vivian, he's right. The deeds are recorded. Mr. Rhodes currently holds 62.4% of the total voting power of this association." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Vivian swayed behind the podium, the room spinning slightly. She had built a fortress of restrictive covenants and petty neighborhood tyranny, and this man had simply bought the ground beneath it. "You can't do this," Vivian hissed, abandoning the microphone, leaning over the podium to glare at Damien. "You think you can just buy your way into our community and destroy it because you have a chip on your shoulder? Because of a little misunderstanding with the police?" "It was not a misunderstanding," Damien replied, his voice a low, carrying baritone that demanded absolute silence. "It was the weaponization of municipal authority fueled by your inherent prejudice. You saw a black man in a hoodie and assumed criminality. You bypassed emergency services to call a desk sergeant you had on speed dial, intentionally framing an innocent man as a threat to trigger an aggressive police response." "I was protecting the neighborhood," Vivian shouted, tears of pure, impotent rage stinging her eyes. "You were protecting your fragile, outdated worldview," Damien countered smoothly. "But we are not just here to discuss your bigotry, Mrs. Hargrove. We are here to discuss your accounting." Vivian froze. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking like a wax statue. Damien turned to the crowd of wealthy homeowners. "When I acquired the majority stake, I immediately exercised my right to order an expedited forensic audit of the association's operating accounts, an audit that has not been independently conducted in years." Richard Kane handed another stack of papers to the secretary. "The audit reveals that over the last decade, Mrs. Hargrove has funneled approximately $140,000 of association dues into private contractors who exclusively serviced her own residents. Roof repairs, landscaping, and the installation of a heated driveway, all billed to the Oakwell Terrace Historic Preservation Society under the guise of district beautification." The ballroom erupted. The very neighbors who had feared Vivian mere moments ago were now out for her blood. Wealthy people, Damien knew, could tolerate arrogance, but they absolutely loathed being stolen from. "Order! Order!" Vivian cried, but her voice was drowned out by the angry shouts of her former friends. Damien waited for the noise to subside slightly before delivering the final blow. "As the majority shareholder, I am calling for an immediate vote. Motion 1, the permanent removal of Vivian Hargrove from the presidency and the board of directors. Motion 2, the initiation of a civil lawsuit against Mrs. Hargrove by this association to recover all embezzled funds, plus legal fees." "I second," Arthur, the older board member, said loudly over the din, glaring at Vivian. "The votes are cast," Damien said, not even looking back at the crowd. "With my 62%, the motions pass. You have hours to hand over all association materials to my legal team, Vivian. If you attempt to destroy any records, the civil suit will immediately become a criminal referral to the district attorney." Vivian Hargrove looked out at the room of people who despised her, then down at the man who had effortlessly dismantled her life's work in a matter of minutes. She had nothing left to say. The Queen of Oakwell Terrace slowly stepped away from the podium, Her shoulders slumped, and walked out a side door, utterly broken by the karma she had summoned. Fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, agonizing hum inside the sterile, windowless conference room of the Internal Affairs Division at police headquarters. The air was notoriously stagnant in this part of the building, smelling faintly of industrial floor wax, stale coffee, and the sharp, metallic tang of impending doom. Officer Vance Harlan sat rigid in a hard plastic chair, his heavy shoulders squared in a defensive posture. Beside him, his union representative shifted uncomfortably, a sheen of nervous sweat reflecting off his forehead. Across the scuffed metal table sat Captain Grant, a man who looked as though he had not slept in a decade, flanked by two stone-faced IA detectives. But what made the bile rise in Harlan's throat, what made his stomach churn with an unfamiliar, icy dread, was the woman sitting perfectly composed in the corner of the room. Charlotte Kane did not look like she belonged in a police precinct. Dressed in an immaculate charcoal pantsuit, her posture was relaxed, yet she radiated an aura of lethal, concentrated power. Captain Grant rubbed his temples, dragging a heavy sigh from the depths of his chest. "Officer Harlan, we are convening today to formally review the events at 412 Commonwealth Avenue, specifically the escalation and subsequent detainment of Mr. Damien Rhodes on his own property." "I followed procedure to the letter, Captain." Harlan deflected immediately, his voice defensive but lacking its usual aggressive, barking bite. He leaned forward, appealing to the brotherhood of the badge. "I received a direct call regarding a suspicious person casing a high-value property. I arrived on the scene. The subject was entirely uncooperative. He refused a lawful order to identify himself, and his body language was hostile. I drew my taser to maintain control of an unpredictable, potentially dangerous environment. It was a textbook response." One of the IA detectives, a woman with sharp, analytical eyes, looked down at a thick transcript of the viral video. "He was drinking a morning coffee, Harlan," she noted dryly, her tone devoid of sympathy. "He was wearing slippers. He stated clearly, multiple times, that he owned the building. He made no sudden movements until you lunged at him." "People lie, Detective," Harlan snapped, the pressure beginning to crack his facade. "Suspects lie every day. It is my job to secure the scene of It is your job to establish a reasonable, articulable suspicion that a crime has been committed before detaining a citizen," Charlotte Kane interrupted. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. It was perfectly modulated and entirely stripped of emotion, which made it absolutely terrifying. She uncrossed her legs and opened her thick leather portfolio, the snap of the metal clasp echoing like a gunshot. "My firm, Kane, Klein & Associates, is not merely representing Mr. Rhodes in a simple harassment claim." Harlan's union rep swallowed hard, attempting to assert some authority. "Ms. Kane, with all due respect, this is an internal police disciplinary matter. Your presence here is a courtesy granted by the captain." "My presence here is a warning," Charlotte corrected sharply, sliding 3 heavily laden, red-tabbed folders across the metal table. They came to a stop directly in front of Captain Grant. "When the high-resolution video of Officer Harlan assaulting my client went viral, our office switchboard was inundated. It appears that Officer Harlan has a highly documented, geographically specific pattern of behavior that this department has willfully ignored." Captain Grant opened the first folder. As his eyes scanned the summary page, the color began to drain from his face. "Folder 1, Charlotte narrated, her gaze fixed dead on Harlan. "Terrence Johnson, a delivery driver, pulled over by Officer Harlan months ago for a broken taillight. He was detained on the curb for over an hour, and his vehicle was illegally searched without a warrant or probable cause." Folder 2, Mateo Ramirez, a local college student, harassed, shoved against a brick wall, and threatened with arrest for loitering while waiting for a city bus in the rain. Harlan gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. "These are baseless civilian complaints. Street work is ugly, it's messy. You sit in a glass tower. You don't understand what it takes to keep those neighborhoods." "I understand liability, Officer Harlan. I understand it intimately," Charlotte said, leaning forward. The icy calm remained, but her eyes were ablaze with absolute legal fury. "By the close of business today, Kane, Klein & Associates will formally file a federal class-action civil rights lawsuit against the city of Boston, this specific precinct, and you personally. We are citing a systemic, racially motivated deprivation of constitutional rights under color of law. Furthermore, we have already notified the Department of Justice, and they have expressed keen interest in opening a full pattern or practice investigation into your precinct's leadership. The silence that followed was suffocating. Captain Grant closed the folder slowly, looking at Harlan as if he were looking at a live, ticking explosive. The precinct could survive one bad viral video. They could write a settlement check, issue a public apology, and sweep the bad PR under the rug. But a federal class action lawsuit led by a ruthless apex predator corporate law firm, backed by the DOJ and funded by an aggrieved billionaire with endless resources, that was a career-ending, foundation-shattering extinction event for everyone in the chain of command. "Vance," the union rep whispered, leaning in so close Harlan could feel the man's panicked breath on his neck. "You need to resign right now, today. If you resign, surrender your certification voluntarily, and agree to never work in law enforcement or armed security again, they might drop the personal liability suit against you. If you fight this, the union will not back you. You are going to federal prison, and your pension is already gone." Harlan stared blankly at the cinder block wall, the blood pounding a chaotic rhythm in his ears. The arrogant, unwavering certainty that had guided his entire life had evaporated into thin air. He realized, with a crushing, inescapable clarity, that the man sitting quietly on the brownstone steps had not just been a citizen who knew his civil rights. He had been a trap, a brilliant, patient trap that Harlan had eagerly, violently sprinted right into, blinded by his own unchecked prejudice. Harlan's voice cracked. The bully was finally backed into a corner he could not punch his way out of. He looked at Captain Grant but found only disgust. He looked at Charlotte but found only a predator waiting for the kill. "I'll sign the papers." Captain Grant nodded grimly to the IA detectives. "Process his badge and his weapon. You're done, Harlan. Pack your locker and get out of my building before the end of the day." The crisp autumn breeze had sharpened into a biting early winter chill that promised snow. Damien Rhodes walked out onto the polished mahogany steps of his historic brownstone. He was wearing his favorite faded gray Yale hoodie, his worn, comfortable sweatpants, and his scuffed moccasins. In his hands, he cradled a steaming mug of dark pour-over coffee. He sat down heavily on the top step, resting his broad back against the cold, familiar stone pillar. The street was profoundly, beautifully quiet. Directly across the way, the sheer curtains of the second-floor drawing room were pulled wide open, revealing an empty, dark, and lifeless space. A prominent, freshly painted "For Sale" sign was staked deeply into Vivian Hargrove's once immaculate front lawn. The moving trucks had come and gone. She had been forced to quietly list the property, at a loss to cover the massive, ruinous legal settlement she owed the neighborhood association she had once ruled with an iron fist. Her fiefdom was gone, dismantled legally and permanently. A marked police cruiser turned the corner onto Commonwealth Avenue. It did not speed. It did not aggressively hug the curb or squeal its tires. It rolled slowly down the cobblestone street, keeping a watchful, protective, and respectful pace. As the cruiser passed Damien's building, the officer behind the wheel, a young woman with a sharp, alert, and professional gaze, made eye contact with Damien sitting on his steps. She did not glare. She did not reach for her radio to call in a suspicious person. She simply raised a gloved hand and offered a polite, respectful nod, acknowledging a citizen peacefully enjoying his morning on his own property. Damien nodded back, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. He took a long sip of his coffee, closing his eyes and listening to the city slowly wake up around him. The very acoustics of the neighborhood had fundamentally changed. It was still quiet, yes, but it was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of insulation, exclusion, and unchecked prejudice. It was the clear, ringing silence of peace, a peace that was hard-won, rigorously defended, and deeply deserved. True power, Damien mused, as the sun began to peek over the historic brick rooflines, rarely announced itself with wailing sirens, drawn weapons, or the shrill demanding cries of a neighborhood tyrant. It resided quietly in the truth. It lived in the absolute certainty of one's rights and in the patient, methodical application of justice. When prejudice had blinded an officer and a neighbor to his humanity, they had eagerly weaponized the very systems meant to protect society. But karma, when expertly guided by intellect, patience, and resources, was a devastatingly precise force. He had not responded with chaotic violence or blind anger. He had responded with surgical precision, dismantling the financial and professional safety nets of those who sought to degrade him. The ultimate victory was not just his own personal vindication, it was the structural sanitation of his community, leaving behind a lasting proof that true security is built on mutual respect, and that bigotry is eventually the most expensive and ruinous mistake one can ever make. Damien took one last breath of the cold morning air, feeling the warmth of the coffee spread through his chest. He was finally, truly home. True power rarely announces itself with sirens, drawn weapons, or the shrill demands of a neighborhood tyrant. It resides quietly in the truth, in the absolute certainty of one's rights, and in the patient, methodical application of justice. This story illuminates the catastrophic collision between systemic arrogance and undeniable accountability. When prejudice blinded an officer and a neighbor to the reality of the man before them, they weaponized the very systems meant to protect society. However, karma, when expertly guided by intellect and resources, is a devastating force. Damien did not respond with chaotic violence. He responded with surgical precision, dismantling the financial and professional lives of those who sought to degrade him. The ultimate victory was not just personal vindication, but the structural sanitation of his community, proving that true security is built on respect, and bigotry is eventually the most expensive mistake one can make. One of the most powerful lessons from this story is that true strength is not always loud, aggressive, or visible at first glance. Sometimes, real power is the quiet confidence of a person who knows their worth even when the world tries to question it. Damien was judged not by his character, success, or humanity, but by his appearance. Because of prejudice and arrogance, others assumed he did not belong in a place he had every right to call home. That kind of injustice happens in real life more often than people admit. We live in a world where some are still measured by what they wear, where they stand, or how others choose to see them. But this story reminds us that dignity is stronger than hatred, truth is stronger than lies, and patience is stronger than cruelty. Damien did not lose control, even when he was humiliated and threatened. Instead, he stood firm, protected his peace, and let truth reveal itself in the end. That is a lesson every one of us should carry in our heart. Never judge someone by appearances, never use power to humiliate others, and never underestimate the quiet resilience of a person who has fought hard to become who they are. In the end, respect, self-worth, and justice will always matter more than status or prejudice. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever seen someone be unfairly judged and later prove everyone wrong? And if you love meaningful, emotional stories with real-life lessons, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next powerful story.